The date is February the 25th, 1956, and we begin today's episode not in China, but next door in the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin has been dead for 3 years, and his successor Nikita Khrushchev appears before the Soviet Congress. And in this secret speech, Khrushchev shocks the room by beginning a tirade against his dead predecessor. Now, Khrushchev went to town, ripping into Stalin for his use of terror and for purging Russia of many good communists with his murders in the 1930s. He held up Lenin's testament, a document that Stalin had suppressed where Lenin warned of Stalin's abuse of power if he became the leader. And last of all, Khrushchev denounced Stalin for making a communist cult of personality around himself. The Soviet Union, the leaders of the communist world, had begun their process of De-Stalinization. And as news of this speech reached the rest of the world, Mao Zedong looked on with one thought: I am in big trouble.
Hello there.
Okay, so today we carry on in our China series by looking at something called the 100 Flowers Campaign. But we really can't understand this episode without understanding what happened over in Russia. And as the Soviet Union began to say, hey, we denounce what Stalin did, he's a monster that we want nothing to do with, Mao watched on quite fearfully. You see, everything that Khrushchev criticized Stalin for could also be a criticism that could be extended to Mao. Mao frequently used terror and ordered the execution of many so-called counter-revolutionaries, and he'd most certainly built a cult of personality around himself. So if Mao was going to keep the Soviet Union on side, and if Mao was going to show China that he wasn't like Stalin, who was now an enemy of the communist world, he had to take action. He had to make a new image of himself. And in 1956, he was presented with that opportunity. You see, China was 7 years into CCP leadership, and it was starting to industrialize as a country. Now, with these new factories came experts in industry, and these industrial experts rose in power. And so a group called the cadres felt threatened by that power. Now, cadres were simply the people who enacted the CCP's wishes at a local level, but they were worried they were losing influence to these new experts who were telling the CCP what they should do with their factories. And so, seeing an opportunity to rebrand himself, Mao stepped in. In May of 1956, he declared,
"Let 100 flowers bloom and let 100 schools of thought contend."
Basically, people had the license to say what they wanted about how China should be governed. Now, if you're thinking this is an uncharacteristically Mao move, you'd be exactly right. Historians contend a few ideas. Some say he had a genuine change of heart, some say he was trying to bait rebels into treason. I think for me, the most likely explanation was that he was trying to make himself look different to Stalin and not look like a ruthless tyrant. Nonetheless, as Mao intervened in the cadre expert dispute, he opened the door to criticism about the Chinese government. The only problem for Mao was that people were only too willing to offer their criticism, given that they'd been waiting 7 years to share it. In Henan, the People's Daily, the CCP-run newspaper, announced that they would no longer parrot the party. Many suggested that Chinese people should have increased legislation protecting human rights, with Liu Shaoqi, Mao's number 2, even arguing that counter-revolutionaries should have their lawful rights protected. The CCP was also criticised for its economic management. According to some, they tried to produce too much too quickly, and so the quality of their industrial goods was bad. Others said they tried to collectivise the farms too quickly and moved too many people onto the same farm at once. At the CCP Congress in 1956, the leader of the army, Peng Dehuai, affirmed that China was ruled by a collective leadership and not solely by Mao. Now, what also happened was that these conferences, they usually made some sort of reference to Mao Zedong thought being essential to China. But at this Congress in 1956, no one made such reference, the first time that Mao had been ignored since wartime. Now, what also happened at the conference as well was Zhao Enlai also said that China could benefit from confronting its mistakes as the Soviet Union had done themselves. Now, imagine how Mao felt about that one. But the scathing criticisms of Mao went even further. The Guangming Daily went as far to question as to whether China should stick with one-party rule, and there was mass striking that broke out. You see, in 1956 alone, Shanghai saw 86 strikes. Perhaps Mao had just got this one wrong. Maybe opening the floodgates was a mistake for the chairman, perhaps the critics had just gone too far on this one. But Mao simply couldn't just say stop because that would make him look terrible. You can't invite criticism to then only reject that criticism, that would make him look like Stalin. So Mao came up with another way of framing things. In 1957, he said that the critics were not offering constructive criticism, but were exploiting the 100 Flowers Campaign to try and overthrow the government. He argued that these rightists had to be purged and that the foundations of the party had to be protected at all costs. Now, having said they would not just toe the party line, the People's Daily reverted to being the news arm of the CCP, and for a week they offered a new editorial each day about how bad these rightists actually were. Now, Mao tasked Deng Xiaoping, and we'll get to know him a little bit better in a future episode, he tasked Deng Xiaoping with purging the rightists from China. And in an effort similar to the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries a half-decade earlier, the CCP went to town. In 1958, 53% of criminal cases involved counter-revolutionary activity. Imagine half of Australia's court cases being about terrorism. But many would not even be allowed to appear before court. Many leading intellectuals and universities would be placed into re-education camps without any trial. I think Liu Shaoqi's quote when speaking to the Indian government captures the CCP's perspective perfectly during all of this. He said, "No matter whether the party's line is correct or mistaken, the party must safeguard its unity." It was clear. The Hundred Flowers Campaign had been an absolute disaster for Mao, and he was badly in need of a PR victory. If he wasn't able to convince the USSR that he wasn't like Stalin, he would just convince them that he was a bigger, badder version of Stalin and that they should fear him rather than him fear them. And we'll see this desperate attempt next week as Mao began his great leap forward. Thanks for watching. Please hit subscribe if you haven't. The more traction this channel gets, the more we can resource these videos and the more we can actually improve them too. Make sure to tune in next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.